Hello, welcome to Epicenter Bitcoin, the show which talks about the technologies, projects, and startups driving decentralization and the global cryptocurrency revolution. My name is Sébastien Couture.
And my name is Brian Hoffman. We're here today with another Brian Hoffman, so it's going to be confusing. He is the lead developer, so the main guy behind OpenBazaar. I'm sure many of you have heard of OpenBazaar. OpenBazaar is the idea to have a completely decentralized marketplace. It's a really revolutionary idea, really interesting idea, and huge potential. So really excited to talk about that today. Now, before we get started, and before I'll let Brian introduce himself a bit as well, we just wanted to mention briefly the Inside Bitcoins conference that's coming up in Berlin. So that's going to be on March 5th and 6th. I'm going to be there. Sebastian is going to be there. Sean Jones is also going to be there. So it will be everyone's going to be there. I'm also going to give a talk, like one of the keynotes on the second day. About many of the issues we've been talking about over the last months, sort of surrounding Bitcoin economics and the sort of long-term feasibility of Bitcoin. So I really look forward to that. And actually, we're also going to be organizing a meetup on the evening before the conference. I think Sebastian is going to give a talk then. And we're going to have a few other talks. So I think it will be a big meetup, perhaps, or I expect. Hopefully we'll have like 100 people or something. So it should be fun. So if anybody wants to come or is planning to come, please let us know. I would love to meet up. And also you can get 15% off with the discount code Epicenter IBC for Inside Bitcoins conference, I guess. Yeah, so Epicenter IBC in all caps. 15% off. If the discount code doesn't work, we'll have it in the show notes as well. Brian, can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in the cryptocurrency space and how you got started with OpenBazaar?
Sure. So I guess I've been following Bitcoin in general for quite a bit of time now, and I hadn't been involved in any projects or any kind of coding in regards to the technology, but I was looking for something important to kind of get involved with, and I am not really sure why, but when I saw the demonstration about dark market up in Toronto at their hackathon, it looked like something that was pretty powerful, pretty interesting idea, and I saw that they had released the source code on GitHub, and so I looked into it, and it was something that immediately I thought, okay, I can get involved with this. I think it's probably in my skill set to start poking around and get involved. I actually emailed Amir Taki, who came up with the idea for that and started that proof of concept about getting involved, and that he was planning on basically relinquishing the code to the community and just letting it go. They weren't planning on it any further. It was just like a 48-hour project, and so he said, just go ahead and do whatever you want to do with it. At the time, they were pretty busy with Dark Wallet, and they still are. So they didn't really have the bandwidth to kind of work on it. And so I think about that time, Reddit was kind of hyping the idea up, and everybody was getting excited about it. But it kind of took a quick turn towards the whole Silk Road kind of aspect of it, and the name was just like this huge controversy, and it was really disappointing to me personally because I felt like there was this huge potential for like a paradigm shift in the way that we were using cryptocurrencies, and they were just so focused on like the name. It was just kind of ridiculous, crazy it was getting. And so I just said, you know what, let's take the code, let's rename it, and just try and start clean, and maybe people will start to focus on the actual important aspects of the project. And so
I
that's what I
think it
did.
was on the Beyond Bitcoin podcast that you talked about fundamentalism, and this kind of demonstrates, to what extent people can be, can feel strongly about certain things when it's so charged with ideology. But I completely agree with you that changing the name to something more accessible to people, and that sort of distances itself from the dark web aspect of it, is definitely important and very valuable if you want to have some sort of mass adoption with this.
Well, I mean, another important part of that was that if a project was not going to be run by the dark wallet team, it didn't really make sense to kind of keep that dark something branding. I didn't think that that was something we wanted to do, because it kind of unnecessarily associated us with them,
Right.
And their team, and they're not involved. So it also was a good way to separate that.
So what's the main idea behind OpenBazaar?
The main idea is that right now, with the decentralized Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, we have this kind of currency application, and we have a bunch of ideas all around how we use it, and we have wallets and all this stuff, but people are still kind of scrambling around saying, well, where's the merchant adoption, or where can I use it? Like, it's only valuable if you can use it. And for the longest time, it seemed like it was really primarily valuable because of the speculation. As the price was going up, that's what people were finding it valuable as. They were saying, okay, I'll buy it now, and in 6 months, hopefully I'll make all this money. And not really paying attention too much to how they were using it on a daily basis. I still find myself having that issue, and if you saw that CNN special the other day, you saw that he had trouble spending, Morgan Spurlock had trouble spending his money as well. And so I think a lot of where the business building in Bitcoin has gone is, building like a Coinbase or a BitPay, where's a point of sale terminal, all these things to try and get traditional businesses using Bitcoin. And that's great, that's kind of been covered, but how do we make it, how do we enable all these people online that want to use Bitcoin to use it to do online e-commerce, and also kind of keep the spirit of decentralization? Do we really need a big business like eBay or PayPal or somebody like that to kind of sit in the middle and babysit our e-commerce? We have this awesome peer-to-peer currency. Where is that business network? Where's that e-commerce network that'll allow us to kind of seamlessly use it? And so that's where we see this huge potential, at least for the first application of what OpenBazaar could be. And as we go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great way of putting it, and I hadn't even thought of it like that before, right? Because if you look at, and I think that's one of the problems we've been having in Bitcoin, is that there's not enough incentive for users to adopt Bitcoin. Unless you love the technology, or a libertarian, or want to speculate on that, why would you use Bitcoin? There's very, very few cases where it actually makes sense. I mean, I guess using dark market is another one. And now, if something like Microsoft accepts Bitcoin, well, it doesn't matter for most people, right? Because you were already able to buy there. It's not like a reason to then go out and buy Bitcoin, for example, or get involved in cryptocurrencies. But then, of course, that's totally different with OpenBazaar now, because that is something you will have possibilities there that just aren't accessible unless you have cryptocurrencies, unless you engage in cryptocurrencies. So I mean, I agree. I think that's a great way of putting it. That it really it may well be more powerful in driving adoption than all this merchant adoption for merchants, where you can already pay with credit cards anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that the darknet market kind of aspect of Bitcoin has been so negatively talked about because of the actual content that is being sold, right? But the people that are truly really analyzing it properly are looking at it and saying, look, they are demonstrating the value of using a cryptocurrency, right? Like they have built a working marketplace, a community, a reputation, system. It's just it's a proof. It's a use case. It's proving the technology, and if you can take that and you can apply it in a broader sense, like don't just focus so much on selling drugs or guns or whatever. If we can bring that back into like what you would call the clear net, it could be used for just about anything. And it's like they've done all the legwork of just really showing that it can function. So what we're doing is we're not going to replicate that exact business in the dark web and just bring it out for everybody to use. And I think it's going to be super powerful. I think when people get comfortable, they get beyond that whole I don't want to use it for Silk Road type stuff, perception. I think there's going to be a huge drive for adoption of these kinds of projects, technologies.
So could you walk us through a simple transaction? So let's say I'm a small business, or maybe I'm an artisan. I make I don't know, wooden spoons, and I want to sell them on OpenBazaar, or using OpenBazaar, and I want to protect myself from fraud or from buyers that maybe aren't going to pay me. So I want to use an arbiter. So let's say a simple like 3-person transaction where there's a seller, an arbiter, and a buyer. Can you describe how that works? What's the process for initiating the transaction up until delivery of a product, let's say?
Sure. So there's a lot of things involved with what you just said, right? And that's what makes this project, I think, pretty complex, is that there's like several really complex and challenging areas, and we're trying to do all of them at once, right? So I'll just, I'll give you the kind of high-level walkthrough of like a transaction, like what you described. So first of all, OpenBazaar, we're building it as a protocol and platform that can be used for just about any type of business. So as we build that protocol and design it, we're also building our own example client. It's kind of similar to Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is a protocol, but it has, they have the Satoshi client, the wallet, that is kind of the reference implementation of that protocol. And so we also have a client software that we're building that basically is the basic use case of OpenBazaar. And the way that it works for what you described is you would essentially download this client as a merchant or a buyer. It's all the same client. So the merchant, we'll just start from where the merchant is actually putting the item for sale. So he would install this application, and you can customize your storefront and all that stuff. And then you can add a listing into the OpenBazaar network. And what happens is it looks very much like it would, for like an e-commerce tool, where you can put a title, description, price, etc., about your item, pictures, whatever. On the back side, what's happening is the client is generating what is called a Ricardian contract, and all that is it's a structured JSON document. JSON, I mean, for non-programmers, it's basically just a way to format the description of your listing. But at the same time, because it's a Ricardian contract, it's also very human readable. And so it's almost like a real contract. If you were to look at it, a computer could understand it and do what it needs to do because it's structured, but also humans can look at it and very clearly understand what the terms of the listing and contract and service is. And so our client would generate that, and it would announce it to the network. A buyer would come and download this same application and say search for wooden spoons, and your listing for wooden spoon would show up in your client just like you would if you were searching eBay or whatever. You'd click on that listing, and if it looked good, you'd say purchase, just like you always would in e-commerce tools. And then the thing that or where it starts to deviate from the normal transaction online is normally you would assume that the the merchant is also the arbiter, or perhaps PayPal is the arbiter. In this case, we don't have that, right, because it's just truly peer-to-peer. So the third party is what we call a notary. They're essentially an arbiter. But you can choose from a list of notaries that are on the network, and they all have, or they're going to, once the protocol is finished, but they will have a reputation score associated with them, and you'll be able to kind of rank notaries and choose one that you trust that has a good fee structure, and they would serve willingly as the third party to your purchase. And it's important to note that this third party doesn't exist unless, well, they don't enter into the equation unless there's a problem.
Yeah, one question here. So
sure.
If I'm assuming I'm the buyer now, and I look for wooden spoons in my OpenBazaar client, how then does Sebastien's listing get to me, right? Because there's no server in the middle that I'm like calling that gives me all the listings. So how does that process of distributing the contracts and offers work?
So when you open up your application and you connect to the network, it goes out to a couple kind of like super nodes on the network who help you kind of bootstrap your visibility of all the different users on the system. And then what it does is it together all those clients, as they're talking to each other, they create what is called a distributed hash table, which is basically a giant distributed database. And this is where we kind of store information that's necessary for doing like product discovery and other aspects like finding notaries and stuff like that. So when you open up your app and you search for an item, it will basically go out to that network and look for listing IDs that match what you're searching for, and then you can go directly to those peers and get that data.
And could you, so you mentioned the reference client, so this assumes that someone could develop an app, perhaps a merchant platform based on OpenBazaar, on the protocol. I forgot where I was going with this. Could you, yeah, so could a merchant have OpenBazaar contracts on some other platform? This could be a proprietary platform like eBay. I mean, that would be very useful, but it could be like on his website, for example, or on another market app or platform like on Tor or either on the ClearWeb.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where we want to go with it, right? So we are publishing kind of the structure for these different Ricardian contracts, so you can easily build any kind of tool or integrate it into any existing system to generate those contracts. So for instance, like let's say Craigslist wanted to get their stuff out onto the OpenBazaar network. They could, if you create a Craigslist listing, they could easily put all that data into a Ricardian contract behind the scenes and then create an OpenBazaar link. And so when you search on Craigslist and find like a listing that you like, if there was a link, you would click it and it would open your OpenBazaar client and you could use it to find that peer who's offering that service or whatever and do it through OpenBazaar. So, and you could do the same thing with other e-commerce sites, instead of like, buy it here, you could do buy it on OpenBazaar or whatever. Or they could even, just do all that behind the scenes anyway. So yeah, we're building a platform. The client, we're hoping to have kind of this API where people who have custom applications that wanted to use OpenBazaar could just like call the API and do whatever they need to do, and talk through our core client.
Cool. Well, that sounds really interesting. We'll get back to OpenBazaar, and we want to get into Ricardian contracts, how those work, arbitration, and also talk about sort of new paradigm stuff. In just a few minutes, before we do that, I'd like to talk about our sponsor, Shapeshift. So Shapeshift, as you know, is the fast and easy way to buy and sell altcoins. They support about a dozen different altcoins, and what we'd like to do today is demonstrate one of their one of the features that they've developed, which is the shapeshift lens. And so shapeshift lens is basically a it's a Chrome extension, sorry, and that Chrome extension allows you anywhere in your browser that you see a Bitcoin address, you'll be able to pay with any altcoin that they support without having to go through their website or anything like that. So directly on the website that you see the Bitcoin address, you've got a little icon. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you how this works. So today we're on the OpenBazaar GitHub page. And since we're talking about OpenBazaar, we might as well donate to OpenBazaar. So I've got a Bitcoin address right here. So this is a multi-sig address, and I've got the Shapeshift Chrome extension installed. You can get that on the Chrome Web Store. And so all I do is just click on the little icon. So it's went ahead and detected that that Bitcoin address. I just click here on the Shapeshift icon, and I say pay with, and I'm going to pay with Dogecoin. And so it'll generate this little window here on your screen. You can set the amount or not. You don't have to. You can just send whatever. But if you set the amount, it'll specify what amount you should send to it. So I'm going to go ahead and pay. And here I've got a QR code. And I'm going to use my Dogecoin wallet to scan that. There we go. And I'm just going to send $1. There we go. So send, and that transaction will be processed by the network, and in a few minutes we'll be able to see that transaction on the blockchain. So the nice thing about Shapeshift, among other things, is that it doesn't require you to send them any of your personal information. You stay completely anonymous when you use it. You don't even have to give them your email address. So that's a great thing about it, and it's fast. So as soon as you send the like in this case Dogecoin, they don't wait for any confirmation. So as soon as they receive the transaction, they take care of sending the other currency to the party you're sending it to. So go to shapeshift.io, give it a try, tell us what you think, and we'd like to thank Shapeshift for their support of Epicenter Bitcoin.
And quite possibly the first Doge donation. Of course, it gets to you guys as a Bitcoin donation, but at least it was sent as a Doge donation. So I don't know if perhaps somebody has done it before with the same Shapeshift lens, and you wouldn't know.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we were at.
I think we were talking about how it works.
Contract. What were you saying?
I think we were talking about how it works. But before we get to Ricardian contracts, I'd like just to come back to the example. So could you sort of just walk us through how this transaction would work? Like, so I put my my wooden spoons up on OpenBazaar, and then say Brian or one of you is interested in buying my nice wooden spoons to make some music, and you go ahead and pay for it with Bitcoin. Can you describe the process there, like how the contracts get generated, etc.?
Sure. So so when a user buys that contract, kind of where I was at when he says I want to buy this service or this product, he'll choose that third party, the notary, and then once that's done, he will basically he'll digitally sign that contract, that offer, right? So it has the original information, which is about the merchant and the service, and then he kind of adds some of his own data, which is like what he'll bid on the contract or what he's going to pay and all that. And then he'll take that, he'll digitally sign it, and he'll send that copy to the notary. The notary would then say, yeah, I'll be third party to this transaction. And what he does is, because now he has that contract, it includes the merchant and the buyer's data, he has their Bitcoin public keys, and then he takes his public key and he is able to create a special escrow address from those three keys. And so therefore at that point the transaction is a 2 of 3 multi-signature transaction, and so the funds will only go somewhere once 2 of the 3 of them agree to do so. And so you can see that at that point, right, like this whole transaction could occur without any interaction with the notary beyond just him initially agreeing, because the buyer and seller have the power to move the funds either way on their own. And therefore, that's how OpenBazaar can basically be a feeless e-commerce solution, because when things are properly done, everybody's happy. There's no one in the middle to say, zoink, I'm going to take some fees from you guys just for showing up to our house. So that's one really big benefit of using OpenBazaar. While at the same time, if something does go wrong, you do have that third party involved, and they can be brought in to do arbitration if necessary. So at that point, the notary he generates that escrow address, and he sends his signed copy of that contract back to all parties. So everybody's got a contract of the 3 parties having signed this agreement, this transaction. Within the client, it's a lot simpler than kind of what I'm describing. I'm talking behind the scenes. So basically, what happens is once the notary has signed it, he'll just mark it in the app that he's on board, and then everybody will get notified that the transaction is going on. The buyer can then deposit the money for that item into the escrow address, and once that's done, the merchant will see that the money is in that account, that it's available, and it's locked, and then he will be able to ship the item. Once the buyer sees that the item has been shipped and everything is all good, then he would say, okay, go ahead, release the funds, and then the multi-signature transaction would be signed and sent to the merchant. The merchant could then sign it and broadcast it to the Bitcoin network, and the money will be moved, and everybody's happy. So that's the happy case in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I think the amazing thing about this, is just how much it all bases on this really simple Bitcoin feature, of multi-sig, because this is so powerful. There's so many things you can do, and here we really are sort of replacing one of the essentially. So Bitcoin is essentially replacing 2 of the core functionalities that you could say a platform like eBay has, right? One is the payment side, so that's just purely Bitcoin, right? And then you have the whole dispute side, which then you have the multi-sig with the arbitrator. So it's pretty. I think it's pretty amazing, how powerful multi-sig is.
And at the same time, you described a very simple transaction here, but you can also imagine doing something supremely more complex than a simple 3-party like merchant, buyer, arbiter transaction. You could have multiple arbiters. You could have. I would even go as far as saying that if we have smart oracles, you could even include some of those in the transaction. So, for example, if you wanted to do shipment tracking and have that be sort of one of the ways to unlock funds or to validate that the item was shipped, and that takes becomes one of the signatures to the multi-sig. Someone's working on this with a startup called Handshake. So you could have transactions which are quite complex and they're difficult to recreate today with the systems that we have in place.
Yeah, and obviously what we just talked about is kind of like the most bare bones, simple use case of what we're doing. I mean, we have, our focus is to try and prove it out by doing this and then expanding it from there. But yeah, there's all kinds of different complex things you can do, and like the multi-signature transaction, it doesn't always have to be just 3 parties. There's other ways to include additional parties, and there may be reasons for doing so in different types of deals. So yeah, definitely. I think we're learning as we go, and it won't be long before we'll start looking at more advanced use cases, I think, like what you described.
So we mentioned Ricardian contracts a few times, and it seems like those are sort of a core component of OpenBazaar. Can you explain briefly what those are?
The Ricardian contracts. So the Ricardian contracts are this really ingenious idea. I'd love to be able to take credit for it, but I can't. They were originally kind of thought up by a gentleman named Ian Grigg, and he is kind of the godfather of the Ricardian contract and described what it was and how it kind of would work from a beginner level. And he actually published a white paper, I believe, online about what it is, how they work. And several projects have already begun to look at using them and trying to figure out how they could apply to what they're doing. I know that Open Transactions is one group that uses the Ricardian contract. And also, I think that Ethereum is also looking into ways that they might be able to use Ricardian contracts. They can be very customizable, flexible in ways to support different use cases. There's no like fixed format or structure of like how they look, so they can model just about any kind of online transaction. But like I said before, I mean, the real point of it is that these are contracts that are computer parsable. They're able to be read by computers and used programmatically, while at the same time remaining very human readable. And so you kind of get that dual benefit from that. We have that are working primarily on like contracts and like how they can be used and what our structures are going to be, what the format's going to be. One of them is our main guy is Dr. Washington Sanchez, who's based out of Australia, and he is he's a super smart guy who's working on coming up with our version 1.0 standards for doing these direct transactions, and he's also published a bunch of different little descriptions and walkthroughs of different use cases like peer-to-peer lending and auctions. So like an eBay style auction could be supported with this, and there's a bunch of different ways that the contracts can be extended to support really cool new ideas. And I've even seen people proposing systems like, you know, a decentralized Uber replacement using these contracts. And it's kind of the lifeblood of our project.
Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the question of arbitration. I read that there are two different functions. So there's first is the arbiter, and there's also notary. And I read somewhere that those should be separated. Can you explain that? And why are there two different ones and not just one?
So this is one of the aspects of our project that's still a little up in the air, because we're still trying to figure out what the real best approach is for this. But essentially the reason for the separation is that a notary, in our eyes, is the party that should be responsible for kind of shepherding the transaction. So they're the one that would be signing the transaction, you know, communicating with the other two parties, just kind of handling the basic stuff. Where the arbitration comes in is that at this point, you know, let's say there's a problem. A guy is selling, you know, a fancy watch, and they're arguing over the quality of it or like some detail about it that wasn't, you know, wasn't what the buyer thought. There's some expertise there, right? So when arbitration comes in and he has to determine what to do, then you can bring in this arbiter who would have that expertise, be able to make that kind of decision, and basically advise the notary to do what is in the best interest for all parties.
So the notary acts in on behalf of the parties involved in the transaction?
Yeah, so the notary should be someone that both parties trust. The importance of that can't be overstated, because they're the ones that are that second party. If the buyer somehow had more of an advantage with that notary, there could be collusion against the third party, and they could release funds wherever they wanted, right? Like it even could be the case that the buyer and the notary are the same person, or the merchant and the notary are the same person, and then what would you do? So it's really important that that third party is somebody that both sides uh, trust. And I think that that's going to be one of the big challenges of getting this network off the ground, because any new reputation system or any reputation system in general is going to be gamed at some point, right? Like people are going to try and figure out ways to do fraudulent actions or like collude against naive users.
Right. So that's where reputation becomes really, really crucial now in the selection of the notary and the arbiter as well, right?
Yeah, the reputation. I mean, it's probably the single biggest issue with this project, and the one that's the least solved at this point. We have a lot of really great ideas about what we want to do to solve the problem. We're not really sure if they're going to work. I mean, in the end, this is all a big experiment to see if we can do this in a decentralized way. I mean, there's a reason why businesses that you could consider peer-to-peer are still very centralized. It's much easier to control the experience for all your users and kind of maintain control of what's going on and not let it get out of hand. Like Uber is considered a peer-to-peer service, right? Like I'm offering you a car service, it's just me and you doing things, but there's still Uber is that third party, is that trusted third party, and if there's a problem, we both know that like Uber would step in and handle whatever issue there is, right? Like if the merchant got screwed over or the buyer had some issue merchant, they could step in and do something. They could do that arbitration step. But in a decentralized network where everybody is anonymous, how do you provide that for users? Like how can you do that? Like I can trust Uber. I know they're a company. I can call them. I can write to them. I can go and visit them or whatever. They have a physical address in some country. But like with three parties that are anonymous around the world, how do you do that? And that's the big question that we're trying to answer. And that's a huge part of what we're working on.
I mean, that seems to be one of the sort of absolute core questions in the whole Bitcoin space, and especially in the whole Bitcoin 2.0 space, because there's so many cases where that becomes absolutely critical to get this reputation problem right.
Yeah, and I think that with Bitcoin, that's one of the most that's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is they found a way to create that trustless consensus without having to have that centralized person. That's what's so elegant about the whole design.
Well, what an interesting way to think about how this sort of disrupts the existing model. So now, if we take the peer-to-peer exchange scenario where you have two parties transacting with each other, PayPal, in the case of eBay, would be the arbiter. If there's a dispute, then PayPal would intervene and side on either side after some sort of conflict resolution process. And we pay for that indirectly in fees. You could also argue that within the Visa network or MasterCard credit cards, you pay for some sort of arbitration. Also in banking, like the fees get absorbed in the system. This is somewhat different, where you have to pay directly. You have to it imputes the cost of arbitration on the parties in the transaction directly. How do you think people would react to this? And then secondly, how would arbiters get paid? Do they get paid upfront, like a percentage of the transaction for even being in the transaction, and then get paid extra if they have to intervene, or how does the payment models work?
So So generally right now, the way that it would work is that the notaries have they can decide on their fee structure, right? Like, so they could say, it's going to be, I'll charge 1% of whatever the transaction cost was to serve as your notary if you need me, right? So, and that's decided at purchase time. So in that step where the buyer and the buyer, says I'm going to buy it, and he sends it over to the notary, that's where that notary would put that terms of agreement in there into the Ricardian contract. So that would be stated up front what he would be asking for if there was an issue. So let's say that it gets to the last step, the buyer paid, the seller shipped, and then they're deadlocked. They can't figure out what to do. The buyer won't release the funds or whatever. They could notify that notary, and he would basically, figure out what's going on. He could then add his fee into the transaction, the release funds transaction, and send it to the parties, and then they could sign it and broadcast it. And that would most likely, as he stated, and then it would get broadcast to the network and done that way. So that's where he's able to insert his fees. Now, why do we think that that's going to work? Well, I mean, we're basically democratizing that third-party position, right? So anybody can come onto the network and say, I want to be a notary and serve in that role and start building reputation. It creates another way for people to make income in the system and serve it in that capacity.
Yeah, one idea that we talked about a long time ago, I remember hearing about it and thought this is absolutely brilliant, and this is going to be so important in the future, is the service that bit-rated. You're probably familiar with it, no? But it has the same idea of a marketplace of arbitration. Will you integrate that in some way? It seems like that would be a perfect fit.
Yeah, I think bit-rated is great. I think their newest version is really awesome. We actually talked with Nadav, the creator of bit-rated. We've talked to them before in the past, and then just recently, as they released their new version, because they're doing something that's so similar in the space, but it's very focused on that one aspect of what we're doing, and it's also it's almost like a competitor more than really something that we'd integrate together, I think, because of the different strategy, right? They have a more centralized approach to this. But they're doing something with the same goal in mind, right? They're building a web of trust where people can build reputation and serve as that third party. And so I think that, at some point in time, maybe there's a way that we can work together, great, what we're doing. I think it would be awesome. I think he's a great guy, and their team is awesome, and what they're doing is great. And so I would love to do that. I don't know if I see a perfect fit right now, but maybe in the future.
I mean, one way I could imagine, for example, right, if you have some sort of OpenBazaar client, right, it could offer, like, or it could have an option as sort of a bit-rated certified or bit-rated high-rated arbiter, and it could display that information. It could be like a way. Maybe it could be a secondary layer of reputation, right? That gets pulled in, and I mean, of course, it's not perfect, right? Because it may only be suitable in some use cases, because it does get rid of the anonymity to some extent, right? Like I don't know if you can have pseudonymous arbiters on that, but it seems to be more geared towards the, like, I'm a lawyer and I'm doing this, but for those use cases, it may work well, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're obviously not limiting ours to just real-world people or anything like that, but there are real-world known identities. But I do see a use case there, and I do think that some people will prefer to work on the network like that. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, any way of bringing any kind of trust from another reputation system in and somehow applying that, I think would be beneficial, especially for people that have worked very hard outside of OpenBazaar to build a reputation. I can see, like, for instance, maybe an eBay seller who has like this massive rating and he spent the last 15 years building that, coming to OpenBazaar and becoming like a nobody. would probably kind of suck for them, right? They lose that. But finding ways of bringing other trust into the OpenBazaar network and kind of bootstrapping that trust would be really awesome. And I think, for instance, Bitrated, if they're able to be successful with that and they start getting a lot of traction in that, you know, integrating that into OpenBazaar would be cool, and I think it would be really beneficial to our users.
There's one thing I was thinking about when reading about the arbitration, and Brian, Fabian, I want to get your thoughts on this. Is to what extent could arbitration be like rely on some sort of a distributed consensus or voting mechanism for, I mean, maybe not for transactions where products are sold, because you sort of have to have I mean, it's different, right? But for certain types of transactions, it seems like a distributed voting mechanism could work for arbitrating conflicts.
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly what you're alluding to, but we have actually, Washington wrote a nice little description on GitHub how this might work, is that make that third party actually like a voting pool. And so you could have, you know, let's say 100 people that are part of an organization or that third party, and they could vote and somehow determine what that third party is going to do as a group. You could have some kind of voting mechanism there. There's, you know, these are different things that could be built in, and I'm sure if we're able to succeed and like get you know, get a lot of people using this system, they're going to start thinking about it in ways like that and figure out how to expand that. We don't currently have any plans to implement that stuff right in the near term, but you know, obviously all these things are like sitting there on a whiteboard to look at in the future, and I think that would, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a really nice and sort of obvious way of scaling for like different security needs, right? So you will have cheap arbiters and expensive arbiters, you know, ones with more reputation and more at stake, and then maybe for the sort of, you know, use case of I'm ordering a book from someone and you know, this costs $10 or something, you know, have someone very cheap and it's just one person. But then if something's expensive, of course, yeah, I mean, obviously you would want to have several arbiters, you know, most likely. Maybe you'd have 3 different arbiters, and then a majority decide, or 5 different arbiters, and the majority decide that maybe you'd have certain levels that you say, oh, you're willing to pay more because you want to have a high quality, you know. So it seems like totally nice. I mean, it reminds a lot of Codius, you know. It's the idea of oracles. And it's nice because it like scales super well, right? And maybe you could have, or you could have a first level of arbiters that are like cheaper, and then if there's some dispute there, it could escalate to the next group of arbiters or something like that.
Yeah, and to extend on that, you know, coming back to the example a while ago, you could have like just like for product shipping, you have like a base level arbitration for something that's maybe like a book under $10 would be like the DHL API saying that the product.
Exactly, great point. Yes. No, that's a great point. Exactly, yeah. You could have the first level could be totally automated, could just be the tracking information, and then you could have the escalation, and maybe you would have it that the person who escalates to the next level, it then has to pay the arbitration fees, for example. So you have a disincentive to escalate. But yeah, no, I think that's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really great. I mean, we've actually had discussions around this because, you know, just tossing around the idea of like, I mean, is one third party enough? Like, is the risk of collusion too high if we just have one notary? Should we have a group of notaries? Should we have this hierarchical kind of escalation service as you guys are describing? Like, there's like a ton of ways to maybe look at this and approach it. And the beauty of what we're trying to build is that nobody is limited to that, right? Like, so it's not like we're going to come out and say this is the one way you have to do it. People could craft OpenBazaar compliant clients that do some of the things you're doing. Like if they want to build some really robust network on top of OpenBazaar, they could do so. And So, these are all things that we want to look at. If as soon as I'm sure Washington sees this and some of the other guys on the team, they're going to go nuts, and we're going to be down a rabbit hole trying to figure out how to do what you guys are suggesting and other ideas. So, but that's one of the really great things about this project is that people from all over the world are coming flying in and proposing like these, what you would think are crazy ideas, but they're totally implementable with what we're doing. I mean, it could easily be done. Well, not easily, but it can be done. It's just up to us to kind of think about, how it should be done. And since we haven't really released, we don't know how people are going to want to use it yet. Our strategy is to stay simple and then expand from there. But the future is so bright, I think, for these kinds of technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on a little bit to the sort of bigger picture, I mean, we have been talking about it to some extent, but so one of the things that I've been sort of trying to wrap my head around, and then Sebastian, so you also put that in kind of in one of the questions, right? Is this a platform or a protocol, right? And obviously it's like a protocol, but then the question is, so let's say I was a startup, an entrepreneur, and I wanted to say, like, I want to compete with eBay. So I want to create a for-profit company, and I want to make money with that, hopefully. And I want to provide a service that competes with eBay, or maybe just the buy it now version of eBay at the auction. It doesn't really matter. How would you go about that? Would you fork the project and maybe put in some fees that go to a central party, and then write a client to distribute, or what would the approach be there, or how do you see that playing out?
So I think that's a pretty complex question to answer, right? Like, it depends very much on the type of business you'd want to build. But if we go with the eBay example that you're proposing, so we hope to have to develop a Ricardian contract structure that would support an auction type service. And so that means that clients on the OpenBazaar network that can handle an auction style Ricardian contract would most likely respond in that way. So like, you could essentially check for peers that support that, and they all talk to each other over the OpenBazaar protocol. But basically what would happen is you don't need to fork the code. What we're going to do is the main code will have an API that does a lot of like the fundamental network stuff, like being able to push contracts to the network and talk to peers and do those types of things. And you could just build an app. It could be a centralized app, a distributed app, decentralized app. It could be a mobile app, whatever. It just would need to talk to that client code, the API, and that's how you would interface with other people on the network. So if you were going to build an eBay, you could essentially just build a centralized website, just like eBay, where people go and sign up and do all that stuff, and they create contracts on your system. You would just broadcast your OpenBazaar contracts via the API to other peers, and they could talk that way. In terms of forking the code, I think the only time you really need to fork the code is if you plan on doing something beyond what we're trying to do. Like, for instance, if you were going to build, like you mentioned before, like a darknet marketplace, and you really need to add in some kind of an anonymity layer, like Tor or something like that, then maybe that would be reason to take our code and fork it and extend it in a way that we aren't working on or aren't planning on supporting.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. So that seems also like an obvious use case, right? The dark market. Because I mean, I think you pointed it out really greatly in the beginning, right? So dark markets, obviously, there's been all this criticism, and not surprising. I mean, obviously, people do all kinds of illegal things on them. But at the same time, you can also say this is such a powerful example for the power of cryptocurrencies. Right? This is something that you can't do otherwise. And it's something that there's obviously huge potential demand for, whatever one thinks of that. And now but at the same time, the big flaw is they're centralized, right? So there's all kinds of scams, or they get arrested, or things like that. And then here, once OpenBazaar is running, like you could replace those, right? So you could at least get rid of that centralization. So you could get rid of the scams, or at least these high-level scams. Maybe there would be scams between people, but that's the whole point of reputation, to prevent that, and arbitration. But wouldn't it just be possible that, for example, I would be using Tor, and then you could just use OpenBazaar like that? Why would you have to go a step further, and do you have to build Tor into the protocol itself?
Well, for one thing, I mean, the peer-to-peer network that we've built is at present this is going to get a little technical, I guess, but I don't know any other way to get around it. But essentially, our network, the way that it communicates, supports Tor currently. Like you could run it over Tor. People have run OpenBazaar nodes on Tor. One issue with that is that any nodes on Tor essentially aren't talking with nodes that aren't on Tor, and so it's not like I can be on the network as a non-Tor person, and you can be on the network as a Tor user, because they're separated networks. But the bigger issue is that in our next release, we're going to be moving to a type of peer-to-peer network communication that doesn't support Tor. If you don't know, Tor, the way that it works is when you request something, it goes into the Tor system, it goes to that destination, and then when it comes, it has to somehow come back because of the routing that it does. So you have to use something called TCP type connections. Our newest update is going to be UDP, which is basically the traffic just goes one way, and it doesn't create a connection where it can come back, and therefore Tor is not going to be supported out of the box. That's not to say that we couldn't use something different like I2P, which does support UDP-based communication, but it won't be as easy, and we don't really have it in our roadmap at this time, because implementing that in the near term is, we feel like it's something that we can add on later and support, much like I think what Bitcoin did. Just add it on later after we've solved a lot of the bigger challenges, the more pressing challenges, like actually functioning transactions, the client software, getting it to work on all these different operating systems, things like that, like fundamental experience. We feel like it's way more important to nail down before we worry about securing its usage on the dark net for a very small percentage of our potential users.
Is that also, I mean, it seems like another way of looking at this, and perhaps that's actually a good way, or a big advantage of this for you guys, is when you don't support Tor, because then, the people who want to run those dark nets, and obviously that's going to happen, they will actually have to fork the code, and they will have to run a fork of OpenBazaar, not OpenBazaar itself, right? So, like, I mean, for you guys, it provides a level of protection there, right? That you can say, like, well, what we support is those legal use cases. Now, there are people doing that, but those are different people that fork the project. This is not the project we are running. So it seems like there's a great advantage for you guys in this way.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the fundamental moral issues with working on this project, I think, and that goes for a lot of the developers that we've had come in and out of the project, is that its potential use and like who's going to be using it is up for debate right now. We don't know, since we haven't released. We don't know if we're going to get a wave of legitimate users, or if we're just going to get overrun by people trying to replicate Silk Road. And it doesn't help that, like, every article that comes out about Silk Road, it's like the first comment is like, well, I can't wait till OpenBazaar is out because I don't have to worry about Silk Road. And that's not really what we're building. I mean, yes, this concept, this idea could enable that, but it's just one example of how it could be used, albeit a very highly visible one, and one that comes to the forefront of everybody's mind as soon as you bring it up. But I think that be fighting that perception for a long time to come, and we're doing our best. But like you said, by not supporting that, I think it's and we very much encourage people to read through the code and understand the documentation where it says this is not a secure, anonymous, hiding ground for you to sell stuff. It's just not. Even if we were doing that, it's nowhere clear. It's nowhere close to ready to support that kind of activity. It hasn't been audited or anything like that, and so you cannot trust it to do that kind of activity. And so I think if you were trying to do that, you'd either need to fork it and do all those things so that you can trust it, or you're just insane, because it would be a really bad place to do that. I don't think that people realize that. They think that they're just going to download it and go off on their way selling illegal items, and they're going to be really disappointed when they track them down in like 2 seconds, because right now the software just doesn't support that use.
Cool.
So touching on use cases. Oh, sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to circle back briefly because I sort of jumped ahead. I wanted to ask about the UI question again, and that's a point where I'm a tiny bit still confused. Maybe before we go into the use cases. So, to what extent will, if you have different clients, OpenBazaar clients, to what extent are they interoperable, right? Because I mean, an open a contract in principle, it seems like any client could read any contract and sign any contract, but then at the same time, it seems like there should be this obvious tendency towards a specialization, right? So you would have maybe a site for used furniture, you'd have a site for I don't know, some sort of I don't know, book selling site, or like some eBay type site, or et cetera, et cetera. So how will this work? Because does that mean that to some extent on a client level, you will filter the contracts that come in and only show the sort of the relevant contracts for this kind of application when a person looks for a product in that client? Or how would that work?
So, I mean, I don't think that we've fully fleshed out exactly how that's going to look in the end. But the way I can imagine that it will at least start to look like is once we release the main client and the API, it will support a single basic use case, which is just selling items, right? Like selling a direct sell of an item to a person with 3 parties. And so that contract structure will be, completed. The client will support that and everything. And so I think that the first round of apps that are kind of built on top of OpenBazaar will be more of like maybe a listing aggregation service. So for instance, there's someone already out there who started to build a site. It's called bazaarbay.org. You can go to that site and
yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And you can see his app basically crawls the OpenBazaar network, look for contracts, looks through all the stores, and then he can provide a centralized website where you can go and see all those listings and search through them. And so people can provide additional services on top of the OpenBazaar network by doing extra filtering, or like perhaps they only list contracts that are related to wooden spoons. They could have a wooden spoons emporium and all their contracts are just filtering that out, right? So, and they would have a lot more control over that. They could provide all kinds of different value. And so it's sort of like the Pirate Bay, how it's a centralized service that basically helps the BitTorrent community, right? Like find items on the network. So that's kind of like that first wave of apps I think are going to be like that. And then there's other people that are building tools for like scanning the network and things like that. So that initially will be probably about the extent of what we see on top of it. The next wave will be where people are able to create new e-commerce workflows. So that's where auctions and peer-to-peer lending and things like that will come in. So for instance, you wanted to build a peer-to-peer lending service on top of OpenBazaar, you could create a new Ricardian contract that supports that. You could publish that contract standard, and it basically would outline the workflow, like how that would work, like how many parties are involved, what are the different stages of the transaction, and then other clients could build they could build it into their app as well, and then you guys could all intercommunicate over the same peer-to-peer network. So the details are not really like fully hashed out, but we're starting to figure out how that would work, and we'll probably have a lot more to talk about that in the next few months when we get closer to releasing our first full version.
Right. So coming back to sort of these use cases, and when I talk about use cases, I mean I'm thinking about it in a very sort of long-term way and extrapolating. So this technology gets used and adopted, and then to what extent would the examples we've been talking about so far are pretty basic examples of maybe like peer-to-peer, like person-to-person, or small business to person. But to what extent could large merchants, like I don't know, Amazon or Walmart, or even product manufacturers, like it could be Logitech, or it could be some book publisher, utilize, like what incentive would they have to utilize a technology like OpenBazaar rather than distributing their products on Amazon or through merchants like Walmart or large stores?
So I think for them, a lot of these large organizations already have like a huge customer support type network to kind of help ease any issues there are with the product. So they might not be as incentivized to jump on OpenBazaar at first, but because they could essentially just start doing Bitcoin transactions, right, and save fees and not have to deal with credit card companies or whatever. I think this is way more beneficial, at least at first in our eyes, for, like you said, smaller merchants and users, because there are people that you would consider a small business that run like an eBay store or an Etsy store or whatever, that are making $1 million a year, right, selling items, and they're still paying 10 to 13% to eBay on every transaction. They're getting mad chargebacks from credit cards. They're getting, they have to deal with PayPal, which right there is incentive enough to just find something else to use. And they're just looking for something like this to help them lower that cost, which they can in turn hopefully give back to their users, because I don't know about you, but I've looked at all kinds of different listings on eBay and stuff, and usually the prices are jacked up because of those fees, or their shipping is exorbitant because they have to work that overhead in somehow to make enough money to survive. And when you come into a system like OpenBazaar, now you're suddenly only paying for what you really need to pay for, which is, if I have an issue with my transaction, then only then am I going to pay fees for this arbitration. Like, why should I subsidize the arbitration across the entire platform if I don't need it? And that's kind of the model that eBay works across, is they spread those costs out to every user. And they also pay for a lot of the stuff that allows them to be more centralized. So I think in terms of large businesses, I don't know if they'll find it valuable. Ideologically, there are some businesses that are larger and might do it just because they want to hop on the decentralization wagon and kind of get away from the traditional model. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's probably going to take a lot more traction for our network to get off the ground and really prove itself before big players come in and decide to use it.
So can you talk a little bit, so before we wrap up, we'd like to talk a bit about the organization. So how does that work currently, right? Because you guys did not choose the path that many have chosen of creating your own coin and doing crowdsourcing, that sort of thing. So how are you currently funding development, and what are the plans going forward? Are you planning to monetize it in some way, or are you planning to turn this into some kind of foundation?
I can't tell you exactly what our plans are, because we don't know exactly what they will be for sure yet. We obviously know that we're not going to be able to get as much done if we're just operating at our current level, which is just it's a side project for everybody involved. So at some point we'll probably have to think about a way to fund it in a more organized manner, and whether that's going to be an open foundation or like some kind of commercial corporation kind of way of organizing, I don't know yet. We do know, however, that the core OpenBazaar protocol and network is going to remain open and MIT licensed and stay on GitHub, and it will be free for everybody to use and look through. That's paramount to our project, and will always remain that way for the entirety of it. Now, how we fund it, that hasn't been decided. We do know that we don't like to do the coin aspect, and we have stayed away from crowdfunding so far because we feel as a community that we would not like to ask too much of our users until we actually have something that's working really well and that they find value with. I don't like some of this like Kickstarter campaigns where somebody, they rake in all this money and then 2 years later they haven't really delivered anything.
I've had a lot of experiences with that.
Yeah, exactly. And it sucks. It really disenfranchises your users, and it kind of blows your reputation. So, we're taking hits on different sites because some people think we haven't moved fast enough or come out with like a working app yet. But you have to understand that like all these guys on the project are working, until 3, 4 in the morning after they come home from their day jobs to work on this, and it's every night. And whether you can see it obviously or not, we pour a lot of our lives and energy into the project, and we don't plan on going away anytime soon. And hopefully in the very near future we'll have something really exciting to show the community, and everybody will be really happy, and they won't have paid a dime for it.
Yeah, and those people can just roll up their sleeves and get the work if they're not happy.
Yeah, no, cool. I think that's a really admirable position to have, and I think that's fantastic.
So I just before we wrap up, how many people are actively contributing to this project?
So I can't remember what the full count is right now. Active serious developers, we probably have about 12 to 20 people, but we've had, I think, almost 200 different contributors on our GitHub repository. I think I saw some statistics recently that said that we're one of the largest Python projects on GitHub, just based on different contributors coming in and actually pushing code to our repository. So it's been overwhelming. Unfortunately, a lot of times you suffer from the too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome, and so we're trying really hard to make sure that people are super. You got 75 contributors on the main branch, and we got like 325 forks. You see that up there, and I mean that's a lot of people. If you look at other repositories, it's pretty up there.
Yeah, and I want to encourage everybody to go with your. So I'm looking at the GitHub page right now. For those of you listening, I want to encourage everybody to go to this to their GitHub repo. We'll have the link in the show notes, and contribute if you can. Donate, of course, if you can, and also this theory work by Dr. Washington Sanchez, who you mentioned earlier, is just really, really interesting. So there are some articles there on Ricardian contracts, on the voting pools, which you mentioned as well, and just really, really interesting white papers that I encourage everybody to read.
Lending, there's
Yeah, and we also, another big reason why some people think it can be a quiet community at times is because we actually have a Slack organization. So if you're not familiar with Slack, it's like an online collaboration tool, and anybody's free to join up. If you get in touch with us, we can get you in there. We try to keep it as focused on people who are really contributing to the project, but it's still open, and a lot of activity in there talking about ways of doing decentralized Bitcoin exchange, building a reputation systems. Actually, the guy I mentioned before that created Ricardian contracts, Ian Grigg, he actually is working with us closely in there on trust and reputation stuff as well. And so there's a lot of exciting talk going on in there that you just can't see from the outside really easily, but there's a lot going on.
So,
Fantastic.
Maybe the last question, what's the timeline here? By what time do you expect that we will have a client that's actually ready, so people will start maybe purchasing, selling things on OpenBazaar?
So right now, the thing that's holding up our next release is there's two issues. One is our peer-to-peer network. Since I mentioned before that we're switching from TCP-based network to a UDP-based network, which is it's all really complex under the scenes, and we want, like, one of the biggest gripes with our software has been connectivity. So if you're behind any kind of a firewall, or you're on a corporate network or school network, or your home router is kind of crappy, like, it makes it hard to do peer-to-peer communication. It's not like a regular website. And so we're trying to solve as many of those issues as possible, so that as many people as possible can use it. And we want to make sure that that's working really well before we release. In terms of a timeline, if tonight a breakthrough comes through, it could be next week. But like I said, because we don't have full-time employees working on this stuff, the development push ebbs and flows, and it just depends on when we can get it out the door. So another good reason not to take funding. We don't have to meet any deadlines, but we're hoping very soon.
Cool, fantastic. And we'll have links to the project as well, and the blog. There's quite a few resources. Also, there's a Reddit, OpenBazaar Reddit. We'll have all of those in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming and joining us today, Brian.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It was great.
I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think this is definitely a project that's going to be extremely interesting to watch. And I think in terms
and probably very controversial as well.
Very controversial. and just I mean, I was mentioning that to Sebastian before. I think in terms of sort of revolutionary potential, this is pretty, this is very much up there with what we've had on the show. I mean, okay, maybe Ethereum, you could say similar, maybe some of the other projects as well, but this is, it's absolutely huge, and I think it could be absolutely huge, and I can't wait to see where this goes.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, we really think that's why we're working on it.
Thanks so much for joining us today, and to a listener, thanks for listening to the podcast or watching the podcast. If you want to support the show, there's a few things you can do. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at Epicenter BTC. You can also leave us an iTunes review if you listen to the show through iTunes, or otherwise we have an iTunes account that helps new people find the show. You can donate to us, maybe with the Shapeshift lens. Give us your Dogecoin, we take them as Bitcoins. At epicenterbitcoin.com/tips, and that's it. Yeah, or get in touch if you have some comments or anything. So thanks for listening, and we look forward to being back next week.